Hey guys, welcome back to part two. We're going to talk more about plants and some evolutionary trends we're going to see in land plants. So here's the story of plant evolution. Basically, it's adaptation to life on land, like we've already mentioned. Adaptation towards increasingly drier habitats as we move away from the sea or freshwater ecosystems. And so nowadays, sporophytes dominate all the vascular plant life cycles. Most of the plant is sporophyte, and most of what we see and most of the time and energy spent on sporophyte. And we think this is probably because spores are more likely to survive in dry conditions. You know, when you think about something like a moss, which is gametophyte dominant, it's it has to release its spores, and its spores have to land in a wet environment that is suitable to mosses to begin to grow. And also, its sperm must swim, you know, and so it needs some water and it needs a wet environment. But when you look at the spores of like pollen grains or seeds or something like that, they can survive a drier environment, and seeds could survive in a dry environment for a really long time until it's a suitable time to grow. And so, really, we're looking at getting used to some dry environments that a lot of life is not in yet. And so, the oak tree is the example they give, has the large and complex sporophyte of the tree. And then the gametophyte is really only a few cells that are going to make the pollen or the ova. And so, some genetic factors that might have influenced sporophyte dominance may have been genetic, the reason this changed in the first place. There are several structural adaptations, which of course would come from your genetics, that's going to help you survive in a more dry environment as we move away from the water. The first is a cuticle. A cuticle is a thick, waxy layer around the epidermis of a leaf, the outside tissue layer of a leaf. And what it does is it helps reduce the water loss. Not a lot of water is going to escape from the leaf. It also can make it a little more difficult for like a little insect to kind of chew through the leaf that has a thick waxy cuticle. We also have stomata, and stomata are little openings, generally, I kind of want to say always, on the underside of a leaf, and they can open and allow for gas exchange, let some carbon dioxide in for that photosynthesis, and they can close and not allow water. You guys know that water will leave a plant through a process called transpiration, and it's basically like a plant sweating. It just lets water out, and stomata can close and keep that water in the plant. And so having these couple adaptations here is really very, very good for surviving on land. Your vascular tissue is going to help you survive away from, you know, ponds or the ocean, because you're going to have an internal system of pipelines, which we call vascular bundles or xylem and phloem, to take a little bit of water from the soil and pump it up the shoot system of your plant. Xylem is going to carry water and some dissolved ions, which you probably already know, and phloem is going to carry sugar. Now, xylem and phloem have a really tough protein in them called lignin, and lignin provides a lot of structural support. The very simple water conducting tubes in mosses do not have lignin, and that's why we don't consider them true xylem. Of course, if you're going to be a plant, you need to have some sort of leaves, no duh, right? Leaves contain veins of vascular tissue, which is our xylem and phloem get all bundled up together, and then they run through leaves, which gives us those cool patterns on leaves that we call leaf venation. And the leaves allow the plant to capture sunlight. That's what leaves do. They're like little solar panels, and they exchange gases for the plant. So very, very important things that you're going to need to survive on land. Here's what xylem looks like. It's just a tube for water. It's not that fancy. It's just like the tubes for water that carry water to your house. And it's kind of cool. They got a cross section of them though. Give them that. And then here is the lignin is stained, which is kind of cool. And so you can see some xylem and some phloem over here, and some xylem over here. And that's pumping water up this squash stem. And you can see all these lignin bands, which makes it very, very tough. And so that's pretty cool. And then this is phloem over here. These are probably sieve plates. and it's going to run water up, sugar down, generally. So that's xylem and phloem. So let's talk pollen. Pollen's super cool. Pollen grains are the gametophyte for flowers and for trees. And that's important that you know that. So pollen grains are a gametophyte. Not a completely developed gametophyte, but a gametophyte. And they will give rise to male gametes. And so what was the entire moss plant was gametophyte dominant. In trees and flowers becomes a pollen grain is the gametophyte, and it's so small that you can barely see it. You kind of need a microscope to really get a good look at a pollen grain, and so that's just kind of a huge change. And they're released by seed-bearing vascular plants, like we said, trees, flowers, that kind of stuff, and they're going to travel to female gametophytes with, if you're a pine tree, the wind, or whoopsies, sorry about that, or insect bodies. Like, bees, of course, are pollinators, but so are moths, butterflies, and even small mammals, bats, rodents, that kind of stuff. You'd be surprised what all can work as a pollinator. But something's going to go to get, nectar or something for food from that flower, and they're going to get pollen all over their bodies, their faces, pollen sacs if it's a bee, or in some really mean flowers, they'll just slap a big pollinia on the forehead of this beetle, and you'll have to carry it around looking like kind of a goofball for a while. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, but they're going to have an animal or something carry that pollen for them, and it allows plants to reproduce in really dry environments. Their sperm don't need to swim. They can put them on a bee, and they can hitch a ride miles away to a different flower, and that makes diversity just huge, and it makes you incredibly successful. So if the pollen makes it to the stigma style ovary of another flower, or the ova of another gametophyte, the female gametophyte, then we are going to make an embryo. And the embryo is the new sporophyte generation. And if you took botany with me, you had to color this, when is it diploid, when is it haploid, and it was a little bit frustrating at times. So the seed is the embryo sporophyte, so the brand new baby diploid tree, 2N, and this nutritive tissue it's enclosed around, thank you mom tree, with a waterproof seed coat that is hopefully going to be a little bit tough, kind of protective. So if like an animal eats it, it can survive the trip down the digestive tract. And if it gets buried in the ground and conditions are kind of crummy for a couple years, it can sort of just chill in the soil till things are good. And a lot of them have features that facilitate their dispersal. Like, I don't know if this doesn't really work for seeds, but think cocklebur. That's actually a fruit, not a seed. But you get the idea. It's got all these little hooks, and the hooks get in the animal's fur, like your dog. And then they brush off the fur a couple days later, and they're planted somewhere new. So, like I said, not technically a seed, that's a fruit, but that kind of helps understand their dispersal. And then angiosperms, of course, disperse seeds inside of a fruit. And pine trees just hope some squirrel buries them and forgets where he buried his food. And then baby pine tree. Here's a different strategy. These are called sori, and those are huge sori. Sori are not normally that big. Singular, it's called sorus, but a sorus, one of these, or sori, all of them, are generally on the underside of a fern leaf or a fern frond, and they're normally lining the marginal leaves, and they are huge clusters of spores. And when the conditions are right, the fern will open the little spore-releasing capsules on a sorus, and it will drop spores all over the place. And so that's one way to disperse your spores. And then here they have a papaya. The spores are not just out on the leaf, they're hidden within a fruit. And then they are dispersed because the seeds in the fruit are eaten by something, and of course deposited in the steaming pile of fertilizer on the forest floor, hopefully a little distance away from the mother plant so that kiddo is not taking all her nutrition from the soil. All right, So here we go. We're gonna do families, family by family. We're gonna go bryophytes, and then we're gonna go ferns, and then we're gonna go trees, and then we're gonna go flowers, and that kind of stuff. So we'll start with bryophytes. Bryophytes are a few different types of plants: mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. The probably the most common plant for you and I, and the one we're gonna see the most is mosses. Is our best example of bryophytes. Mosses are our most diverse, and they're our most familiar group. I'll show you the life cycle here in a minute. And the example of moss is sphagnum moss. I just bought like 2 pounds of this from the greenhouse for our plants in the lab. Uh, Sphagnum moss absorbs a ton of water, and you can buy it as a soil treatment, mix it into your potted plant soils, and then you don't have to water your plants as often because that sphagnum just soaks up water like a sponge. There's 350 different species of just sphagnum moss, probably our most economically important. People have been using it for a long time because it absorbs so much water. You can use it as all sorts of stuff like diapers, and you can make, you know, pack like cushions to sit on with it, and all sorts of weird jobs people have found with it over time. It grows in peat bogs, which are these bogs in high latitude regions, Europe, Asia, and North America. And they'll cut big blocks of sphagnum and roll them up and dry it and basically make a dry moss log, and they can burn it as a fuel, just like we would burn, wood for fire. They will burn blocks of dried moss in their fire, and it helps soil retain a lot of moisture, and that's why they sell it at the greenhouse. So it's worth a lot. It's worth a lot of money. And of course, we don't make diapers out of it anymore, but it's still worth a lot of money just in the greenhouse world. And so here's what your life cycle looks like. It's a little overwhelming at first, but we're gonna start. We're gonna start here. This is new gametophyte grows. Okay, so this fellow dropped some spores. Some of the spores were females. Some of the spores were males. They both grow up into this green leafy junk you step on in the forest floor when you're hiking near a creek, and that's called the gametophyte. So we have a female gametophyte, and we have a male gametophyte. Now, in the female gametophyte, we have an egg. In a male gametophyte, we have sperm. If the sperm gets released from the male gametophyte and can make its way to the female gametophyte, which is the egg, then it can fertilize and make a new embryo. Now, when it's still only one cell, we will call an embryo a zygote. And so let's say the sperm successfully makes it down here. He needs to swim, so we need some water, like rain, and that's what they're showing here. Swims down there and fertilizes and makes a one-cell deal called a zygote. Okay? Now, the zygote divides into a couple of different cells, and we can now call it an embryo. And the embryo grows up right out of the mother gametophyte. All this stuff down here, that is still mom gametophyte. This embryo now, this is diploid. And so all these guys down here were haploid. That's a haploid body, a big haploid body, which is kind of crazy. So this is diploid, and it grows right up out of mom. And when it does that, it grows into this structure right here, which is a diploid sporophyte generation with this long stalk, and then at the end it has a capsule, and the capsule is going to start to make a whole bunch of haploid spores by meiosis. And when the conditions are right, it will open up the capsule and it will let go of these spores, and hopefully a little breeze will make the spores drift away from the moss. And some will be males and some will be females, and the cycle starts over again. And so that's their life cycle. The gametophyte is most of what you see. So in the green moss that you're normally crunching on is as you walk over it is gametophyte. And then these little tiny brown stalks, those are sporophytes, and they're just producing spores. And so it's kind of an odd thing that most of what you see, this picture is really a much larger sporophyte than you're going to see most of the time in the hills. Most of what you see is gametophyte, which is very rare. And so there's just kind of a cool little example of its life cycle. They gotta have water, have to have water. So let's look at bryophytes because that was mosses, but that's not, mosses aren't the only type of bryophyte. There's also liverworts. Liverworts, we found some spores that we're pretty sure are from liverworts, and we think they're about the oldest known fossil of land plants that we have. Some of them have that leafy look like mosses do. Others are in kind of flat sheets, which is how we get the name liverwort because the flat kind of they look like they're lobed, and our liver has lobes, and so these weird little flat plants get the name liverwort that way. The example they use for that's Marchantia, and we'll show you that in just a minute. And then hornworts, they have a pointy horn-like sporophyte, so basically it just looks like, I don't know, like a tiny green pencil that sticks out of the ground. That's about it. The spores form in a little upright capsule called a sporangium, and they do contain chloroplasts because, of course, like they're green and stuff. Oh, maybe we don't have a picture of them. Oh, that's sad. Okay, I'll get you guys a picture of one to show you in class here. So that's liverworts and hornworts. So if we move to seedless vascular plants, think ferns, even though that's not all of them. They don't produce seeds because, like you already know, they produce sorus, and the sorus is how they release all their spores. And these are probably our oldest vascular plants because we have lots of fossils of ferns. I mean, a lot of fossils of ferns. And so we know that ferns have been around for a really long time. And at one point, they probably dominated the plant scene, honestly. So ferns have sperm that can swim. Again, flagellated sperm. So they can only reproduce sexually if there's a lot of water around. And so you're not going to find ferns in really dry environments because sperm have to swim. They're going to release their spores right into the environment. No seeds, no fruits, no fancy stuff. Just drop thousands of spores and hope for the best. We have two lineages surviving today, lycophytes and monilophytes. So there's club mosses, and club mosses grow on the floor of temperate forests. There's whisk ferns and horsetails. Horsetails you can find even here, and they're native to southeastern United States, and they include rushes like the scouring rushes, which are plants that have silica in their cells, and so they're really rough, textured, and you can clean like old pots and pans with them if you're traveling. And ferns are our most diverse and familiar seedless vascular plant. Most of them live in the tropics, but you will find ferns in the Black Hills for sure. You just got to get into some wet, kind of creek side areas, and they'll grow out of the rocks and that kind of stuff, and it's super cool. It makes me want to take you guys out on a hike like I did in botany. And so here you have your ground pine, which is kind of cool. It's not actually a pine tree, but it sure looks like one, just a little, 1 foot tall ground pine. But that's actually a seedless vascular plant, kind of related to a fern, more related to a fern than to a pine tree, even though it looks like a baby Christmas tree. It's kind of fun. And so let's take a look at this life cycle. Where should we start? Let's start with spores. We started with spores last time, right? I kind of like that. Let's start with spores. So a spore is released and it hits the forest floor in a wet environment, and it's doing well there. And so that's point 3 over here. After spores are released, they germinate and grow into a tiny gametophyte, okay? So it starts to grow, and it sends out some little tiny roots, and it starts to divide into a little tiny gametophyte, and it makes this little heart-shaped gametophyte that we call a prothallus or a thallus. And if the environment's good, it's going to grow up in this little heart-shaped plant, and a little tiny baby, and it's going to have the male and the female gametophytes on the same plant. Last time with mosses, we had a male plant, female plant. Now we don't have that. We have, I suppose we'd have to call it like a functioning hermaphrodite, right? It's got both reproductive organs. I don't know what else I'd call it. If it were a flower, I'd call it perfect, but it's not a flower, so I don't know what else to call it. So this is the underside of that gametophyte, because again, these sperms still have to swim, and so we don't want them on the top. We want them on the bottom because that's where most of the water is going to be. And the female is also on the underside of the plant as well. So we have male gametangia, That's these guys, and they produce sperm. We have female gametangia, that's these guys, and they produce egg. So we get a rainstorm, and the sperm take off swimming, and the egg of probably honestly a different plant, not this one, releases chemicals that those sperm can insert sense that you think is appropriate. Smell? Sure, sperm can smell it. I don't know, sense it. They can sense it and they will swim to that egg. But we only have one plant, so let's just say they go up here, even though it's probably not the case. So the sperm go up to, the venter and this long tube, and they get to the egg, and when they do, you guys know the story from here, they make a zygote, right? So the zygote grows out into an embryo, of course, and it starts to look like this, and that is now our sporophyte generation. Gametophyte, gametes. Sporophyte, spores. Fair? And so the sporophyte generation grows up. Now this little tiny heart-shaped dude was sitting down in the ground, and we barely can see him. If you really dig around in some underbrush, you might see him. But most of the time, you're never going to know he's there. So out of this little guy comes this big old fern. And that is what we see. It makes this sporophyte, and these sporophytes can be really tall depending on the type of fern. And the sporophyte undergoes meiosis, not surprising, in these capsules that hold the spores, and we call these sori or sorus. And then when conditions are right, they open up and they drop a ton of spores, and those spores land, and we go again. And so there you go. This is our first time where we see sporophyte dominant. The gametophyte is this little tiny guy living in the ground that we're hardly ever going to see. But the sporophyte is the big fern frond and long old rhizome that's going to grow underneath of the soil. And this guy, he's all but gone. And he might have only been maybe the size of a dime or something like that. It's this little tiny thing in the forest floor you never knew was there. And so we're sporophyte dominant now. Pardon me. All right. So, for the history of our vascular plants, the guys that can have true xylem and phloem and really pump water and sugars, the oldest forest we know about was probably somewhere in the order of 385 million years ago, and plants were 8 meters high, so you can take, what's that, times 3, 24 feet, something like that, and resembled tree ferns. So basically they weren't true trees, they were ferns. And so 300 million years ago, your forest would look like mosses, horsetails, ferns, wet, humid environment. And I don't really have a lot of arguments with that, and we can talk about that in class if you'd like, but I think that's kind of cool. Giant plants, really massive stems, it's sporophyte dominant, and that's what your forest might look like. And so the fossil record indicates to us that our sea level has kind of risen and fallen quite a few times. And so when the waters would recede back, our forests would do very well. And then when our waters would rise back up, we would bury a lot of the forest in sediment, and it decomposes very slow if it's buried by the ocean water and sediment. And as you get a lot of pressure on that dead plant material, it'll squeeze that water out of the remains and generate just a little bit of heat. And as it generates that heat, and bacteria can't really decompose it, you get the good pressure and heat combination. You can actually turn these plants into coal. And that's where we got the name of the Carboniferous period, and the Carboniferous forest means carbon producing, time period, or carbon producing forest, because as those forests were crushed, they made coal. And so that's the evolutionary timeline kind of view of that thing. And so when we look at seed plants, gymnosperms don't evolve for quite a bit later, because gymnosperms, a whole different animal compared to a fern. So late in the Devonian period, we've had animals and stuff around for all sorts of a long time before gymnosperms get on the scene. And the representatives of our modern gymnosperms first appeared in the late Carboniferous, so kind of that stuff that's going to start to make coal. And the angiosperms occurred even later, during the Cretaceous. And the advantages of the seed-bearing plants were their reproductive traits, being able to be carried by a pollinator, being able to survive a dry environment that's maybe not going to be flooded by the ocean all the time, and then their structural traits as well, like being able to grow up really tall. So that's kind of a cool thing. Being able to withstand drought, that sort of stuff. And so here's what this looks like. You have pollen through meiosis makes a microspore. That a microspore is in a pollen sac, sometimes called a pollinia. And so that could be on the anther of a flower, or it could be in the male cone of a pine tree or spruce tree, if you like. And so those little pollen will develop into sperm-producing male gametophytes, which is the pollen grain that has its little weird pollen grain wings and it's ready to be released. And so, sometime in July, the tree decides now's go time, and all of the male pine cones release their pollen, and this little yellow junk floats all over the place, or rather, the anther produces pollen grains that are ready to go, and they get attached to a bee, and they come and they meet the female gametophyte in the ovule, because the female gametophyte started with an ovule, and through meiosis they made megaspores, and the megaspores made an egg, and the sperm and the egg unite. That's fertilization. Fertilization makes a zygote, and instead of just dropping a spore this time, we're making some weird little brown sporophyte thing grow out of the top of a pine tree. We just form a seed around the embryo, and we drop that seed to the ground, and we see what happens with it. And so that's really beneficial for a dry environment, because you don't have to wait till conditions are right for rain and drop it and hope for the best. You can go have a squirrel bury that seed for you, and the seed can germinate when conditions are right. And so there's that. All right, so let's stop there because I think I'm getting pretty close to my 20-minute time limit. We'll come back next time and we will talk gymnosperms and we'll talk angiosperms. So thanks for your time.